Welcome to Podjunction, where business meets podcasting. Whether you're on a morning jog, driving to work, whipping up a meal, or just simply taking a minute for yourself, our weekly bite-sized episodes promise fresh insights from successful podcasters who have cracked the code of using podcasts to grow their business. So whether you're a podcasting newbie or a seasoned podcaster, this episode is for you.
Well, hello, welcome to a brand new episode of the Podjunction podcast with me, your host, Matt Edmondson, and beside me is COVID Bainon. How are we doing, COVID?
Much better.
Yeah, good. She called me at the weekend, just sounding like, you didn't sound like you're in a healthy place. That's for sure. It was definitely not a good place, but you've tested negative. So
I have.
Yeah. It's really interesting. I know this is a show about podcasting, but on this whole COVID thing, I can't remember the last time I took a COVID test. I think I'm impressed you actually did the test.
Well, I only did it because someone told me I should. And not just that, actually handed me a test.
Oh, was that Jeff?
No, it wasn't. I was actually supposed to be helping out at the church, and I went to the church to help out. And she was like, I think you should take a COVID test. Brought me the test.
Wow, that's good, because I don't even know if I've got any.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, isn't it, how the world's changed with this attitude towards COVID. So yeah, COVID sat next to me, recovering COVID addict here. Welcome to Podjunction, where we talk about podcasting, how to use podcasting to grow your business and cure COVID. Absolutely. It's amazing what podcasting can do. We're finding out every week, something new and exciting. But if this is your first time with us, very warm welcome to you. It's great to have you with us. Like I say, we just talk about podcasting, how to use it to help us grow our own businesses. I don't even know what episode we're on now. 19?
We are on 19.
In my head, I've got that Paul Hardcastle. Do you remember Paul Hardcastle?
No.
The song 19. Just Google Paul Hardcastle 19. It was a song, I think, from the 80s. 19. No, 19. And it was, anyway.
No, I don't know.
It's a slightly political song. But I've got the tune in my head. I think I'm showing my age slightly. So welcome to episode 19. There is a nice back catalogue. And basically, the way we do this, if you don't know, if you are new to us, we chat to experts. Ask them a whole bunch of questions, and then we chat about it. Mm-hmm. Usually. Yeah. I don't know how much chatting you're going to do today.
Lots.
Yeah?
Yeah.
I've been in bed the last week. I've got plenty of vocal exercise in me. I've not talked to anybody. So yeah, that's what we're going to do. So in today's show, we have... That's your cue. Okay.
I'm on the slow train, but I'm going to do lots of talking. Okay, so we've got Lee Houghton, who is the host of... Business Problem Solved.
You are on the slow train today, aren't you?
Business Problem Solved podcast.
Mm-hmm. And
in this particular segment, he's talking about his interview style and how it's changed over time.
Fantastic. We're looking forward to this. Lee's a great guy. I've been on his show. That's how I met him. He invited me on his podcast. Feels like a while ago now, actually. But he's a great guy. And so I'm curious to hear what he has to say about the interview thing. So are we going straight into that, or have you got another segment?
I have a question.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So
I must remember this. We always do the question thing now before the talk. This is a new feature.
Yes.
Well, it's not really new anymore.
Newish. Whenever you remember it, it's new.
4, yeah. Okay, what's the question?
Okay, so if you could instantly gain one skill to improve your podcast, what would that be?
If I could instantly gain one skill, does this have to be a real thing?
No, you can do whatever you want.
Can be like a superpower.
Yeah, that'd be fun.
Well, my desired superpower is the ability just to instantly appear wherever I want. I just think it and I'm just there. Like some kind of teleportation portal type thing.
Okay.
Which would be just kind of cool. So if I could do that, that would make podcasting really cool.
So how would that work with podcasting?
Well, then I could do in-person interviews all the time.
Ah, okay.
And it's like, I'm going to come to you, and then we're going to go sit on a beach in, the Maldives and do the podcast recording.
So you can teleport other people too?
Well, yeah. Just really.
Just checking.
Be a bit lonely otherwise, wouldn't it? Or maybe that's the point. I don't know. I just need to get away. Right, I'm going the Maldives. Leave me alone. So yeah, that would. I don't know if that's the right answer to the
There
question.
is no right answer.
Okay. So yeah, teleportation, I think, is a skill that I am lacking at the moment when it comes to podcasting.
Okay.
The ability to read people's minds. That would also be good, when you're asking them questions.
You can preempt what they're going to say. Well, you're going to know what they're going to say.
So I could ask better questions, I think. I think interview, because podcasting for me is all about asking the right questions to the people you're talking to. And so the skill of asking better questions is probably a more sensible skill.
You can have both. You can have
if
two,
I can have
Matt.
both. Well, yeah. Tell you what, I'm so looking forward to that first teleportation episode. I think it will do well on YouTube. I think people will be curious to see what happens.
Yes.
Very good. All right. Well, should we do the whatevery bit, the clip?
Yeah,
with
the
Lee.
whatevery bit.
The whatevery bit. Technical term. So we're going to play the clip from Lee. I think it's like 6-7 minutes long, and then we're going to be back to chat about it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, assuming you're awake.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Here's Lee. And what's interesting here is that the way I'm hearing you say this is, as you've personally grown, as you've evolved, as you become more comfortable, more confident, the depth of the questions that you ask has also increased, right? And it's really interesting, isn't it? When you start out, you're just like, so tell me, what's the weather doing where you are? And then by the time you've done a few episodes, you're like, what's the biggest challenge you've ever faced in life? Let's dig. Do you know what I mean? And you get straight into some of the meaty stuff now, don't you? And you're not afraid to do that, I think, and that's a confidence thing maybe that comes with time. And your podcast style evolves, and you're right. I think if I reflect on my own journey, it's a lot more me that's changed than everything else. I mean, I can tell you little bits in the podcast that have changed, a theme and blah blah blah, but actually, the main culprit in the changes is myself, which is what you found, right?
Yes. Yeah, I think just to pick up on that as well, my first few interviews, I researched the guest. I identified like 7 or 8 questions that I wanted to ask, and I wrote a post-it down, and I had them on the top right-hand bit of my screen here, and I was so fixated on working my way through this recipe of questions. I wasn't actually listening to what people were saying to me. And then now I've ditched it, and I just asked 3 questions. Tell me, like, what's your story? How did you get to that seat? What are you having for your tea? And where can people find out about you? And we just have a conversation. It's just a pure conversation now. And what it's helped me develop. So I'm a leadership coach and business improvement person. And what it's allowed me to do now is just become really comfortable with silence, really comfortable asking those I'm going to call them killer questions, but they're kind of real critical questions. And it's allowed me to have far more better, that's some brilliant English. It's far more improved conversations with, it's not improved my English, any. That's coming from Charlie. But my ability to have conversations has developed through my honing of the podcast. And I think that's something that I was never expecting. And so it's allowed me to just develop doing what I do as well. It's 'cause every week it's just an opportunity to just really hone your conversational skills to get to the crux and the nub of the situation and the person, because I'm conscious that people are going to be listening to it. So I've got to be a little bit better. I've got to improve. I've got to ask the better questions. What questions would other people be wanting to understand as well? Like when you just started then, and you, it would have been quite easy for you to skip over the 3 lessons of Chris and just go on to the podcast question, but you didn't. You stopped and you asked about that question, and I think that's a skill and it's an art. It's just the ability to listen to what is actually being said, and that's something else that's really been honed by me doing the podcast.
Yeah, no, it's just, again, fascinating, isn't it? And like you, I used to have trays and trays of questions for the guests, and you're just like, well, where do I ask that? And you'd spend hours thinking about the sort of the layout of the questions, like the route, the journey that you wanted people to go down. And now it's just like, no, I just have 1 or 2 fallback questions in case the conversation gets stifled. But the reality of it is, I don't have any, and it's just going to be a conversation. And I think that when it comes to having real, authentic conversations, what have you found, Lee, that makes a difference? How do you I guess do that now? What are some of the lessons that you've learned there?
So the number one lesson for me is just actually listening to what the other person has said and giving them a full opportunity to finish saying what they're saying. So when I started, I used to be before. So if this was the other way around, and I was having a conversation with you for my pod, I'd be when I first started, I'd be thinking of my next question to ask while you were still answering the question that I just asked. But now it's just actually let's the answer fully come out and then use that to create the next question. And that's taken a lot of confidence to kind of get to that space and be really comfortable not having a question to ask and you using the narrative of the guest. So I think that the listening is key. And I think the width of the question as well. So our ability to ask questions, I think, is fundamental in business and in conversations. And often we bias our question with what we think they may answer or the direction that we want them to go. And I think just by asking, instead of I try never to ask a why question now. So why is that the case, or why did that happen? Because I think that's that could be a little bit personal. And I try to ask a what and a how question, because what I found is that really widens the answers that they're giving. So what was the reason for that happening is different to why did you do that? And I think it just gives such more breadth of an answer from the guest, because you're not like really narrow in your question. So I think what and how questions, but just questions that are really short as well. I think I would say those two things: the ability to listen and truly listen to the answers that are being said and be comfortable with it, not having a question to ask. And then the second one is just really all about the ability to ask a short question that's a what and a how question that just allows the thoughts of the other person to just be so them to allow and to explore their thoughts fully, rather than be biased with what you think and the direction that you want to go. So I would say those two things are the main things. And I think it's so natural in life as well. So like Chris's second lesson about making good friends. If you want to make good friends, you've got to really listen and have be invested in the words that the other person is saying, and then you've got to show an interest in that other person as well. And by you asking a question based on what they've said, I think really shows that you've listened to that other person as well, and you want them to feel that, you want them to feel special. So I would say those two things.
Very good, very good. Thanks, Lee. That was as he was chatting away. I remember that conversation quite clearly in my head. Yeah. It was a great conversation. And make sure you listen to the full version of that, because he talks about his friend Chris, who's a best friend that passed away, and there were some lessons that Chris sort of passed on to him. So when he's talking about Chris in that interview, that's who he's talking about, right? Yeah. And it's a really powerful story, that Lee has. And so, but Lee's a legend. I mean, just an absolute legend, and just so down to earth from Chorley. Yeah, Chorley. My Chorley accent's not good, so I'm not going to... That's as far as I'm going to go. But Lee, legend. Thanks for coming on, man. Have we got Lee again next week?
We do.
Excellent. So we're going to get some more wisdom from Lee.
Yes.
What did you make of that?
I thought it was really good. I thought it was really interesting, some of the things he pulled out. I think what you... like from the conversation, from where it started, it sounded like you guys had already been talking about some of the ways that the interview skills have evolved, but really when it came down to it, it was yourselves that had there was a lot of personal growth and development in the process, which I thought was really cool. Do you want to comment on that?
Sure. Okay, if I have permission.
Yes, you have permission. I just felt like maybe I shouldn't do all the talking this time.
No, it's fine. You crack on. You're much more interested than I am. I think it's interesting. We've talked about this before, haven't we, with podcasting, that it is a journey. You grow on that journey, and the podcast changes. So we're on episode 19 of Podjunction. I've not listened to episode 1 for a little while, but I imagine it's going to be a little bit different. And there's going to be some more changes coming probably in the next 5 or 10 episodes that we've got planned, right? And so the podcast does evolve, and you do change it and you do tweak it, and you kind of think, well, if we did this, we could do that, and we'll have a little play. But the thing that does change the most is yourself, especially if you're interviewing people, and you become a lot more confident about your show. Yeah. So now, I think when you're starting out, you're just in awe of the whole thing, and anybody that comes on your show, you're just super grateful for. And don't get me wrong, I'm still super grateful for guests, but now I think actually I'm much more confident in the show, and so when we get big guests on, I'm not surprised. Whereas when you're starting out, you'd be like, what? Kind of wetting yourself a little bit, but that's okay. It's I think the biggest change in podcasting is on the podcast host, especially in these conversational style interview ones, which we're a big proponent of. And that was definitely Lee's finding. That's definitely mine.
Yeah. And I also, to add to that, like how he talked about going from Post-it notes and being really, it was really structured. He was so caught up in what question's going to come next that he wasn't listening. And it went from that part of his journey to where now it's more conversational, more fluid. It's a lot more of listening to the other person and then responding to what they've said rather than pulling something out off of the Post-it note, I guess.
Yeah. And I think, again, that's going to come down to the style of podcast you want to do, right? So if you want to do the more Diary of the CEO kind of interview style podcast, or the Carey Nieuwhof style interview podcast, then I think you have to spend a lot of time researching your guest, because these guys come on the show, they're probably authors, there's stuff that, they want to talk about, and they're expecting you to ask them really good questions around certain topics or certain ideas. And if you don't know what they are, then, this is, I suppose, the danger of doing something quite broad. Whereas both Lee and I, we chat around topics which are quite narrow, quite niche. So I'll talk, say, for example, about e-commerce. I'm pretty confident in that whole. And I actually don't mind looking like a fool in the sense of, like, I don't understand what you're talking about. Please explain that. You know what I mean? But I think I can't imagine that happening, say, on Diary of the CEO, because he wants to know, he'll pull out things from the guests' history, because they're usually quite well-known guests. He'll pull out things from their history or things that they've written and go, let's talk about that, because that really interests me. And so I think you have to do some research if you want to do that style show. Where Lee and I do it, and where I think it differs from that, is actually I'm not looking for a polished interview that's going to take a lot of... I was talking to a chap yesterday, Sean O'Neill, who's a legend, actually. We'll get him on the show at some point, because he's just started out in podcasting on episode 20. Check it out. Meet Sean O'Neill. And he's very much done the high studio production. We're going to get nice cameras. We're going to edit the video. We're going to polish it up quite nicely. And I think it's a good thing to do. But the style that I prefer, I like the conversational style rather than the interview style, because conversation is more about discovery. Right? Whereas interview, I want to talk about a specific topic, and I want to make sure the questions I ask don't sound stupid. Whereas conversational is like, in my head, it's like if you're in a pub. Do you know what I mean? And you're just catching up with somebody, and you've got to make that conversation interesting, because other people are gigging in. Do you know what I mean? They're listening into it. And I think if you can do that, that's powerful. And the way you do that, tying it back into my teleportation superpower, is the ability to ask good questions. Which is what Lee was talking about. And so... I think you've got to decide your style. So for Lee, he had Post-it notes. He was trying to do that heavily questioned research style. And what he discovered was, for him, that's not the best fit. He's much more, and he's super chatty, and it's not for everybody. I get that. Some people like to be uber prepared.
Question. So you... Just going back to what you were saying about you're not afraid to look like a fool and just say, what do you mean by that? Is that, so I know you're talking about it in the sense of a conversational podcast like you do, but is there an element of, like, even in that, was that part of your journey, or like being more confident where you're at and the conversation?
Yeah, very much so. I think, again, the more comfortable you feel, again, just to touching back on something Lee said, about comfort. The more comfortable you feel with what you're doing, the less polish you feel like you've got to make it in some respects. Unless you, you know, like if you are going for that highly polished podcast, then that's a different story. But I prefer the way we do it because one, it's just more me. Two, it's an awful lot easier on everybody. I mean, we're not spending 10 hours editing a podcast. It's all done quite quickly. It's all very conversational. It's all very natural. And I think as your confidence grows in that, actually being quite vulnerable with people that you're interviewing is a way to get them to be vulnerable back.
Yeah.
And especially if you're doing something that, like with push, e-commerce, I mean, vulnerability over search engine optimization is probably not necessarily, what we're after. But as we're growing the podcast out, we're going to get e-commerce entrepreneurs onto the show. Actually, there'll be some vulnerability from them, you know, about their story and about their journey. And I think if I can be vulnerable, which often for me is just going, I'm lost on this, or can you explain that a little bit more to me? And I think it's super important. And actually, sometimes I say to guests on the show, I don't really understand what you mean, not because I don't understand it, but because I know somebody listening to the show won't understand it. So I'm always, I suppose the questions I'm thinking of are not just the questions in my head, but if I was listening to this show, what would I ask now? And if I'm new to e-commerce, I'd probably ask this. If I'm experienced in e-commerce, I might ask that. And so it's a bit of a judgment call, but quite often I'll get people to clarify terms, which makes me look like I don't know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. But as a host, do you find that that's like you're constantly going back and forth? Because one, you want to have that natural conversation where you're just chatting and you're getting like discovery, as you called it. And then the other side of it is kind of keeping your audience in mind, because you don't want to forget the fact that there's going to be other people listening to this and it needs to appeal to them too. Or these are the kind of questions they might want to ask. So is that difficult going back and forth in your head, or does it just become second nature the more you do it?
That's a really good question. I think it's something that if you've been in business a while, you probably can do anyway, because I think anything where you've been successful, like business, or we were talking about this last night in the marriage course, but marriage, anything like that, where communication is needed, a successful communicator has the ability to put themselves in other people's shoes. So you, as the host, have to put yourself in the guest's shoes. Yeah. What are they thinking, feeling, experiencing? And you have to go beyond that and put yourself in the listener's shoes and go, what questions would a listener have? Yeah. And also, I'm just genuinely interested, but I'm just, interested / nosy. So I've got the questions in my head as well. And I think, I don't know if in my head now I'm intentionally switching between them. But I know when we started doing them, I would have like different columns on a notepad, like with different avatars. Okay. So who I thought was listening to the show, and I'd kind of glance at it every now and again, and I'd write a question in that column. So if they're a newbie, then I'd kind of like, well, I wonder what they would ask now, or if they're this person, I wonder what they would ask now. And then there's me, and so I don't do that anymore. Maybe I should. I don't know. If you listen to the e-commerce podcast, tell me, should I do that? I don't know, but I do think you get better at it the more you do. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, especially like talking about e-commerce podcasts, we have quite a variety of different listeners, and as in like the different stages of their e-commerce journey. So, and actually you are really good at pulling out parts of what the guest is saying and make it pertain to different parts of our audience. So whether your lists did that for you or what, but it's they used to. I think it like to answer your question. You do grow as your confidence grows, you become more and more aware of it. But this is all part of the journey of becoming a better podcaster. I think you start to understand you need to think about things slightly differently. And what's interesting, what always makes me laugh, is when you take these same skills and you sit around a dinner table with somebody. And you almost go into I'm podcast host mode. So I'm going to start asking you questions. And they can almost feel like there's a barrage of questions coming. And sometimes I'll even do the podcast voice. So I'm sitting around and saying, so tell me about, and I'll throw a bit of emphasis in, because you need to do that with podcasting. And they just sit at the table going, who is this lunatic in front of me?
And as you leave, do you say bye for now?
Yeah, bye for now. You are awesome. Yes. It's normally what happens. Sorry, it's a bit of an in-joke if you've never listened to one of my podcasts. Sadaf won't let me do it on this show because this is technically Sadaf's show. But at the end of every, not that you would know because you've still not introduced any yet.
My time is coming.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Post-COVID.
Post-COVID.
But yeah, on all my podcasts, I always end with "You are awesome." Created awesome. It's just a burden you have to bear. And then I'll say the guest name. They have to bear it. I've got to bear it. And then I'll point to the camera and saying, "You've got to bear it too." Talking to the listener. And it's just one of those things I started doing, I don't know, 2 years ago and just carried on with. It's become like a little trademark.
Yes, it has.
So yeah, I do that at the dinner table. You're awesome. Created awesome. It's just a burden you've got to bear. And the person in front of me is looking at me like, well, it's just very kind of you to say so. I just don't know what to do with this information.
But the chicken is good.
Oh, brilliant.
All right. So do you have any thoughts
On
anything else that he said?
I thought his, what was interesting was the two things that he said were active listening, the ability to listen and riff off the questions, or the ability to riff off of that to create questions.
Yeah.
That's a natural way we do conversation, and bringing that into the podcast is really good. And I think that in itself is a skill that when you start doing podcasts, my advice is, and some people hate this, right? But my advice is always go listen back to that podcast and ask yourself, was there a better question to ask here? Because quite often when we're having conversations with people, we go to that default surface level question, right? Now, bearing in mind, you've got a time limit on your podcast, so you need to get to stuff quicker.
Yeah.
And so asking yourself and training yourself maybe to go beyond the typical question, maybe take it a level or two deeper, I think is a really helpful thing. But actively listen to what they're saying to create the next question, but just do a mental check to say, is there a way to make this question more interesting or take it a little bit deeper?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that might be just throwing in a story for you from, your own life. It might be asking a question about something, whatever it's going to be. That's the thing I think you need to do is like, how do I get a better response or a deeper question here? And I thought it was really interesting what Lee talked about in terms of he stopped asking why because he thought it was a bit too personal. Whereas like, I get that on e-commerce because people listening to e-commerce, it's very practical based. Depending on who they're listening to, but you want to get to the practicalities of it. Like, how do I do this? What do you do?
Yeah.
And I think with Lee's podcast, that makes sense in terms of business. Like, well, how do I solve cash flow issues, for example?
Yeah.
Let's talk about that. But I'd say for push, or what's the story? Why is the great question?
Why questions are my favorite.
Because you're really nosy.
Well, yeah, and I think it also it helps you understand the person better because they keep digging into, well, why is that? And sometimes actually they don't know why, and so they're thinking about it. And
but actually, Lee's right. Sometimes if you start off with the what and the how questions, that can actually lead into nicely, if it makes sense for your show, to get into the why questions and sort of gets people thinking. I think sometimes if you leap in with the why questions, there's a bit too much of a quantum leap for people to sort of make that shift mentally and give you the right answer. And so I think sometimes you have to lead them into that. Would be a suggestion. But yeah, I think I really like that, and so my takeaway from this was, can I ask more what and how questions? How could I ask more what and how questions, and I'm doing some podcast recordings later, so I might have I'll just see how we get on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Something he didn't actually say this, but I think it's part of the journey of like being, because he talked about the personal growth that comes with it over time. I was thinking like also being comfortable with silence.
Yeah, he did say that.
Oh, did he say that?
Yeah, he did say that he was getting more comfortable with silence.
Okay, yeah. So sorry. I thought I was listening. But yeah, I think actually, but I think actually that's something really important, isn't it? Because especially when you're starting out, you're so focused on asking the questions and not allowing there to be any gaps because you want it to be fluid.
Yeah.
But it's so structured that.
Yeah. It's really interesting because if you use something like Descript to edit your podcast, there's a button in there which you can press and it will remove all the silences.
Yeah.
And it will shrink them down to like a third of a second or whatever time you set. 0.3, I think, is the default, 3.3 seconds, which is fine.
For a reel.
Yeah. For, the short form video content. But for a conversation, it just makes it super intense. And the lesson here is actually natural conversation has pauses and silence. So don't be afraid of a little pause and silence. But the most powerful thing about a silence is the guest feels uncomfortable with it.
Yeah.
And I mean this with all due respect to every guest, obviously, that's been on my podcast, but sometimes you're listening to people talk. And I know the best question to ask is not a question, and it's just to sit there silently because they will start to fill it. And you can feel like you're getting into something interesting. And I'm kind of like, if I ask a question here, I don't know if that's going to go where it needs to go to. But if I just look at them and just go, nod my head.
Yeah.
Keep it silent. They will
keep going.
100 times out of 100 fill that silence. I've never had anyone go, why has it gone quiet all of a sudden? Well, that's a bit awkward, isn't it? No, there's a bit of silence. And so then they carry on that thought and that conversation, and you can get some real gold out of that. But I think that's a skill in its own right, because silence makes the guest feel uncomfortable, but it can make you feel uncomfortable as the host. Like, again, you've got to fill it. And this was one of the things I learned when I lived in the States when I was 18, took a year out. I was hanging around with a guy called Jack. He was this sort of 60-year-old, real Southern gentleman, just a lovely chap, was never in a rush for anything. And quite often you would ask Jack a question and he would just look at you for like 30 seconds. And when I first met him, I'm like, what's going on? Does he do it? I don't understand.
Myself, go louder.
And I would. I'd say the question differently, or I'd say it louder, or I'd word it. And it wasn't because he couldn't hear me. It wasn't because he couldn't understand me. It's just he needed time to think. And that was just his way. He was not in a rush to give me an answer to my rushed question. And so I learned then to be happy with a little bit of silence between the question and the answer. And my experience with Jack was when he was silent, you usually got a much better answer. So it always worked out well. So yeah, does that make sense?
It does, yeah.
So yeah, silence is golden, which is a bizarre thing in a podcast. A very bizarre thing in a podcast. But yeah, a little bit of silence is a great question. Top tip. Good. Well, I'm aware of time. Look, we've been going 32 minutes, 55 seconds. Are you closing out the show?
No, you are.
And this is Sadaf's podcast, ladies and gentlemen. So... Listen, it's been Lee's a legend, and we're talking to Lee again next week. We've already ascertained this fact. And yeah, I hope you got a lot out of it. I hope you got a lot out with Lee. Do connect with him. Do listen to his podcast. We'll have a link to Lee and all that sort of stuff in the show notes if you want to do check it out. Make sure you listen to the full conversation, the full story with this one, because like I say, you want to hear what he has to say about Chris. But yeah, if you want to know more, head over to podjunction.com. Very, very, very delicious website. I don't know why I use the word delicious. I just don't.
We're going with it.
Yeah, we're just running with it. This is great. This is great. So it's been great chatting to you. If you haven't done so already, make sure you like, subscribe, and do all that good stuff with the podcast, wherever you get your podcast from, because we've got more great episodes lined up.
Delicious episodes.
And we don't want you to miss any of them. And in case no one's told you yet today, we shall be the first. You are...
Awesome.
Created awesome. It's just a burden you've got to bear. Lee's got to bear it.
Created. Sorry.
Sadaf's got to bear it. I've got to bear it. You've got to bear it too. There you go. We've done it. Are you going to cut this out now?
No, I won't do that to you.
Brilliant. It might be the only time it ever happens on this show, but we'll see how many more we can fit them in as we go along. But no, it's awesome. Thanks for joining us, ladies and gentlemen. We'll see you next week. Bye for now.
And that brings us to the end of today's episode at Podjunction. If you've enjoyed the insights from this episode and want to hear the full conversation with today's special guest, don't forget to visit podjunction.com, where you'll find more information about how you can join Podjunction cohort. Whether you listened while on the go or in a quiet moment, thank you for letting us be a part of your day. Remember, every episode is a chance to gain insights and to transform your business with podcasting. So keep on tuning in, keep on learning, and until next time, happy podcasting.